Yes, absolutely. Tonight, we welcome John Sayles, who is an American independent film director, screenwriter, actor, and novelist. He has twice been nominated for the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay for Passion Fish in 1992 and Lone Star in 1996. And he has been nominated for the National Book Award. He has written a number of novels, including Yellow Earth in 2020 and Jamie McGillivray, The Renegade's Journey in 2023, which was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. Tonight he will be speaking with us about his new novel, To Save the Man, which aims to, quote, shed light on an American tragedy, the Wounded Knee Massacre, and the cultural genocide experienced by the Native American children at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And I cannot imagine a better interlocutor for this conversation than Brenda Child, who is Northrop Professor and former chair of the Departments of American Studies and American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota, where she received the President's Engaged Scholar Award in 2021. She was a Guggenheim Fellow in 2022 to 23, and she was a nonfiction judge for the National Book Awards for 2024. Professor Child is the author of several books in American Indian history, including Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families 1900 to 1940, which won the North American Indian Prose Award, and Holding Our World Together, Ojibwe Women and the Survival of Community. She was president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association from 2017 to 2018, and she was consultant to a major exhibit, Away from Home, American Indian Boarding School Stories at the Heard Museum. We are clearly in for an incredible conversation about a chapter in history that is too often forgotten or suppressed. Please join me in welcoming John Sayles and Brenda Child.
I'm going to read a little bit from the book. The name of the book is To Save the Man. That was actually a fundraising motto used by Captain Pratt, who started the school shortly after the Civil War and ran it for most of his existence. And he was somebody who had survived the Civil War. He had been the commanding officer of African American troops. He had worked with Indian scouts from various nations and came away from that experience feeling like, well, now that I know these people, I feel like they're just as smart as we are and they have as much potential. What's holding them back with the world that we live in right now is their language and their culture. And so his idea was, well, Native Americans were down to about 250,000 people at that time and in very bad shape on having been pushed onto reservations and lied to about, the commodities that they were going to get and stuff like that. He felt like, okay, their only hope is to follow the white man's path, but to do that, I have to at the same time destroy their language and their culture. And so he always said, to save the man, we must kill the Indian. And he was a progressive in his time. So I'm going to read a little bit from the very beginning. This is set in 1890. The book is set in 1890-91, mostly at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and some of it in the new states of North and South Dakota, where things are gearing up for what became the Wounded Knee Massacre. And in my research for this, I came away feeling like the American press was just as responsible for that massacre as the Army was. Muskrat, if you do a decent job with the skinning, scraping, and tanning, will bring you 15 cents a hide at the Mercantile over in La Pointe. Catching them is the easy part. Antoine sees his father standing on the shore, hands cupped around his mouth to call out, "How do we do?" Antoine lets the canoe drift, grabs one by its excuse for a neck to hold it up. "Got 5 in the traps." They carry the canoe from the water, carefully turning it over to rest on an old stump, and lug the chunky rodents by their tails, the footpath through the red pines just wide enough for two. Antoine's father works something over in his mind before he speaks. I talked to the government fellow about this Dawes Act, where they take our land. Antoine has heard some about it from Pierre Etienne, and some more from the Indian agent himself, a man everybody calls the Swamp because of his foul breath. They take it from the tribe, and then they give back some to the head of each household, call it an allotment. How much? 160 acres? Antoine, always good at numbers, tries to imagine this, but can only see the clearing where their cabin is, see the fishing hole and the bank where they put in to harvest rice, all on what he thinks of as their land. Do we use that much? His father looks away. How it goes, he says, is from father to son. At least that's what the Swamp tells me. Yeah? So if your father was French like mine was, you're not considered part of the tribe unless a man who is has adopted you in. So, nobody ever done that for me, not on a piece of paper. But you always live with, they say it don't matter how you live, it's what's on paper. They got people coming up all the way from Milwaukee look like goddamn squarehead Swedes with papers saying they're Ojibwe and they should be on the roll. Well, that isn't fair. That don't matter either. The muskrats are feeling heavy now, and Antoine shifts the biggest one from one hand to the other. It don't matter that your maman goes straight back to old Chief Buffalo. The government says Jacques Lemaire don't qualify for no allotment. They walk a moment in silence. Antoine's father seems more embarrassed than angry when he speaks again. But then I was talking to Père Etienne and Sister Ursula, and they say how if you got one of your children at this Indian school back east, it means that according to this Senator Dawes, you're an Indian. Antoine stops in his tracks, looks at his father. I don't want to go to school in the east. Send Pascal or Renee. You're the one I can spare the most. You're the one who's good at school, the one who reads English good and knows what to say to those people. Antoine hears a woodpecker hammering high in a tree up ahead. He waits until his father will look at him straight in the eye again and speaks forcefully in Ojibwe. Does my mother know about this? At the cabin, Antoine's father stays outside, unhappily yanking muskrat hides off their bodies. Antoine's mother watches a lump of lard melt down in a hot skillet, speaking to him in Ojibwe. There are too many white people to shoot them all. It is the closest she comes to cursing in any language. Antoine stands behind her, awaiting the verdict. I've been to enough school, he says. Père Etienne says it's the only way. I thought you never listened to priests. Antoine's mother dips her finger in a bowl of water, flicks droplets into the skillet, where they pop in the spreading grease. Because they lie. The earth, our earth, is the white man's paradise now, and money is his only god. She deftly places small balls of dough from a floured board into the skillet, sizzling as they begin to fry. I haven't done anything to make you punish me like this, says Antoine. She considers for a moment. If we were in a flood, would you bring a boat to pull us from the water? Yes. If a bear attacked the little ones, would you try to kill it? Yes, but this is what you can do to save us now. Tears form in his mother's eyes as she stares at the frying lumps of bread. Then she turns and puts her arms around him. Don't ever forget who you are. Thank you.
So nice to be with all of you. And, you know, I'm from Minnesota. I teach at the University of Minnesota, and I don't always get a chance to come to Philadelphia. Usually it's in the airport. but I know there was a big sporting event yesterday that I've been hearing about. I'm not sure what it was, but I hear there was something going on. But I do, as a historian and also as an Ojibwe person from the Great Lakes, I want to acknowledge someone. I don't know if I've ever said this, kind of speaking before a group of people, but I'm descended. My great-grandfather was a student at one time at the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And he was one of the first people from our community, Red Lake in northern Minnesota, to go to Carlisle. And the first time I saw his handwriting was in the National Archives, because he had passed away before I was born. And he was writing a letter about my grandmother, who I knew very well, and spent a lot of time with growing up and even into my graduate school years. And her first language was Ojibwe, but she would always, she had a picture on her wall when I was growing up of this old-fashioned, vintagey looking football team. And I was a nosy kid, and so I'd always say, "Grandma, tell me about this picture." And she said, Carlisle. And she said, the man in the middle, in the back row, Jim Thorpe. Mm-hmm. And then two on the same row, in the back row next to Thorpe, my dad. Mm-hmm. So that's what sparked my interest in boarding school history. But I wonder, John, if you could talk a bit about what sparked your interest in writing a novel about Carlisle or about the year 1890. And I know we chatted a little bit backstage, and there was a screenplay you were writing at one time.
Yeah, I was hired, this is over 20 years ago, to write a screenplay based on a famous football game in 1912, which was the last year that Jim Thorpe went to Carlisle. He had already won gold medals for the United States in Sweden at the Olympics. And Carlisle Indians, whose coach was Pop Warner, who invented half the rules of modern football, beat the West Point Cadets, despite being outweighed like 30 pounds per man, when West Point was was one of the best college teams. He managed to knock out the cornerback who was supposed to keep him from going around end, who was Dwight Eisenhower, and never liked to talk about that game. And in writing that, that movie never happened for various reasons. I just got more interested in the school and the history of the school than in the football aspect of it, and started reading back into the history of it. And I think it was this combination of two things. One was, there are not many co-ed military boarding schools in the United States of any kind. And then this was a boarding school where the kids were not just from different tribes, but almost from different worlds. I mean, in the kind of mainstream mind, Indians were Indians. And not a whole lot of difference was seen between them, but it was people from totally different cultures. Some were from Eastern tribes where their people had been speaking English and dealing with white people for 200 years. Some people had never heard a word of English when they went there. There were kids who were literally about to kill their first buffalo when they were dragged there. Some were from families who sent 3-4 generations of kids there because they thought, oh, this is a better school than they'll get to go to locally. And the kids were pretty good at academics, and they graduated, and then their brothers and sisters were sent there. Other kids went there because their parents were lied to. Some were pressured. A lot came from religious boarding schools where all of a sudden it was, oh, well, this kid would be a good candidate to send there. And eventually, because they were good athletes, sometimes they were sent there. So this incredible, mix of kids, and the fact that from reading the accounts of various people who went there, they kind of did become Carlisle Indians, not necessarily what the instructors and Captain Pratt wanted, but to help each other survive. Kids, you were roomed with somebody who didn't speak your language. Sometimes they were from a tribe who had been rivals of your tribe for centuries. Somehow to get through the days and this experience, they kind of bonded together and helped each other through their school. I thought that was an interesting story. And then on the other hand, reading Captain Pratt's biography, Classroom and Battlefield, and then stuff about some of the other major instructors there, Sayles Shah's writing, who taught there for a couple of years and then felt like a traitor and left and wrote about that. This interested in this way that these people who thought they were doing such a good thing, what was their mindset that allowed them to do such a very destructive thing? Knowing that some of the kids were there basically as hostages, knowing that, in some cases actually knowing the cultures that they were trying to destroy. It just seems like a really interesting, dramatic mix. And then I said, well, the nice thing about writing historical fiction is that somebody's written the plot for you already. You just kind of try to get the best version of the plot. My last book starts at the Battle of Culloden and ends at the Battle of Quebec. But you get to pick when you're going to drop the needle, and then what characters are going to be the ones who live these events and see these events, and you can get into their heads. I just felt like, well, when was there the most tension at that school? And because the largest contingent were Lakota kids, I picked 1890 and 91 when this ghost dance phenomenon had been moving eastward from Nevada. Was a guy, Wovoka, had died during an eclipse of the sun, came back shortly after and said, I spoke to the creator of all things, and our long misery is over very soon, and you can make it sooner if you dance this dance, sing these songs, chant these chants. The earth is going to open up and all the white people will be swallowed. As it moved from tribe to tribe, new things were added, languages had to be changed and whatever, and when it got to the Lakota people, who were in really bad straits at that point, this is only about 12 years after Custer's last stand, so this is, these are people who had recently been combatants. One more thing was added, which is, oh, by the way, if anybody does give you trouble, white people's bullets won't penetrate our skins anymore, which made the local white people who were moving into this new state, which had been a territory, very nervous. And then the heads of all the newspapers around the country said, oh, this is going to be good for circulation. And they sent reporters there basically to fan the flames, which they did. And there's a lot of stuff, direct quotes. So very volatile time. And these kids back east, even the ones who couldn't read English before can read it now, and they're reading in the Philadelphia papers, which they got there, in the Carlisle papers, not in their own school paper because it wasn't allowed, about this train wreck that's about to happen, and it's their families who are in the middle of it.
It's interesting to me that you call Carlisle a co-ed school, and I know Carlisle was actually preceded by a program at the Hampton Institute, where there were Native students who came to Hampton and studied in that pioneering African-American institution. And one of the things they were known for at Hampton was a married student program. Of course, that's not like mixing, that wasn't the idea, it was that Indian people were supposed to marry other Native people. And so in thinking about your writing of this book and wanting to present perspectives of students that are young men, young women, what did you do to kind of research that, or to try to present stories that weren't just, the story of a young guy at Carlisle or the young men there, but the female stories as well?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is, one of the things that interests me was this incredible mix of people, and some of the beginnings of a pan-Indian movement came out of Carlisle, not necessarily with the, Pratt's knowledge or desire. I had to know, okay, if you're from the Eastern Cherokee, where is your, where are you coming from? You know, how do your people make their living? What's their history of the moment? You know, how long have they been speaking English, if they have? If you're, you know, from Arizona, from the Tohono O'odham people who were being called Papago then, you know, what's your background? So that was part of it. It was just, what tribe are you from? But then looking into those tribes and saying, what were the boy and girl rules? You know, how far down the white man's path had they been? You know, had they ever been in a co-ed school before? You know, were the local schools, you know, at Carlisle, actually, sports and activities were mostly segregated. They had academics for about half the day and industry for about half the day, and so people were learning trades, and the trades were very sexually segregated. So the girls were getting one thing to do, nursing and sewing and those kind of things, and the boys were getting more, you know, kind of butch trades you know, although the print shop was all boys. But there were, you know, in the classes where you were learning English, they were together in the classroom. And then there were dances and, you know, pageants and things like that where they mixed. So for some of these kids who had been very segregated, sexually segregated, this was really new. A lot of marriages came out of Carlisle, including people from different tribes.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting.
It is interesting.
For these girls, you know, kind of, oh, geez, there's boys around and we get to talk to them, and it's not a disgrace.
It's kind of fun to think about that. My new book is about the history of American Indian marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do talk a little bit about the boarding school marriages, and especially the story of some of the folks from Carlisle. Fantastic. I really like that kind of gender analysis and pulling that out. But you know, one thing that I write about a little bit later period in the boarding school history, not so much the 1890s, but into the early 20th century. And if you would ask me, why did parents, or why were children in government boarding school after the turn of the century, I would say the number one reason was death of a mother. And a lot of kids ended up, because family situations were changing, people were you know, going through very difficult economic times. But I sort of wonder, maybe to challenge you a little bit, thinking about someone like Zikala Shah going from the Yankton Reservation off to, in her case, a Quaker boarding school first in Indiana. And you mention the warfare that's taking place on the Northern Plains, right? And that Carlisle's established in 1879, but 1890, this year that you focus on, this is the year of Wounded Knee. And so families are still very vulnerable on the Northern and Southern Plains. They're involved in military conflict against the United States. And I wonder if you might think about the idea that some parents made a decision to send their children to a place like Carlisle because it was a safe place for them to go. Because families, you know, it wasn't just get your fighting force and the cavalry, it was the military conflict was on Indian communities.
Yeah, it was actually Captain Pratt chose Carlisle because he felt like he could, if he tried to run a school like that anywhere west of the Mississippi, the kids would not be safe. The conflict had been so recent there that he felt like these kids couldn't go into town, you know, without, you know, being beaten up or, you know, worse. So I think there probably was some of that for these people. Also, on especially the San Carlos reservation, Apache reservation, diseases were, you know, there was no cure for any diseases back then, any of these communicable diseases. White people were dying in droves from them. But when you take people who are usually moving around, they're usually spread out a little bit, living outdoors half of their lives, and you stick them and say you have to stay all together in a much smaller space than you were before, those diseases can come in. And so there was a lot of consumption, you know, tuberculosis in that one. There were kids who were coming there with tuberculosis. And I think some of it was also, you know, it's not necessarily just war, it's people are dying here.
I, it's these stories are very connected, and you really can't look at the history of government boarding schools without trying to understand more about the history of disease.
Yeah.
And I didn't know very much about tuberculosis before I started doing my research. I didn't know anything about trachoma, the eye disease it was sort of strictly an Indian health problem in the US in the early 20th century. And I had never heard of the global influenza pandemic of 1918, 1920 until I read about it in the boarding school records, because the boarding schools were full of kids with the influenza a century ago. So how did you want to present that story of disease?
Well, I have a scarlatina epidemic come through in the school. You see early on, they had various doctors there, including a couple native doctors later on, after 1890. Probably the health care at Carlisle was about as good as it was in small town white America.
Right.
They actually had a clinic. They did what they could, but healthcare was all palliative then. It was like, you put all the kids with one disease in the same place, so they don't give it to the kids with the other disease or the kids who don't have a disease. So one of the first things you see is induction day, and very often they would get a kid, and the doctor would be told, anybody who you don't think is going to make it for a month, send them back. So there were kids who died on the train, sent back after one day at Carlisle. At that, and then later on, there were several outbreaks there, but they happened in the town too. They didn't just happen, at the school, and there wasn't much they could do. One of the things that happened with Carlisle kids is that if your parents had enough money, and many of them had no money at all, you could go in the non-academic season, which was a couple months, you could go home, and then you could come back if you wanted to. If your parents didn't have that money, you stayed there. You were farmed out to a local farm, and you did agricultural work for a couple months. And then when the new crop of new kids and the returnees came, you were brought back into the academic year. Same thing if you died there. So still to this day, tribes are sending contingents of people to reclaim, their ancestors' remains who went into the ever-growing cemetery because they didn't have the money to send the bodies back. But some family did, and they put them on the mail train.
One of the problems that kind of exacerbated the TB issue with the boarding schools at the time is that many of the people who ran the schools and even public health physicians at the time thought that there was something wrong with Native people, their bodies, because of heredity. They were inferior, their bodies were inferior. And so it wasn't the case that everyone had an appreciation that overcrowding boarding schools, putting kids together in the same dormitories, having other students serve as nurses, which you also portray in the novel, is problematic. And you think, well, how could they have not known how tuberculosis was spread, right? But there wasn't 100% consensus on how TB was spread in the late 19th century. And so, and I want to kind of point out our recent experience with the pandemic. Do you remember when everyone was getting their grocery deliveries and wiping everything down with alcohol, and before we'd let it, we weren't sure how this new virus was spread, which I think gives us a little more maybe understanding of how people were somewhat confused. Now that would change in the early 20th century, where they began to know that it was spread person to person, sputum, disease, overcrowding was bad. But the boarding schools didn't necessarily change their practices when they had more information about how disease was spread.
Two things I ran into in the Carlisle records was doctors talking about kids being undernourished. I would say it was malnourished. One of the things that was happening at the Indian agencies, Native Americans were not made citizens until 1924. So at the time of this book, they're wards of the state. If you were on a reservation, you could not leave that reservation without the Indian agent's permission. even to go to another reservation with people of your tribe who spoke your language. If you left the Carlisle School, you were a fugitive from the law if you left.
We didn't always obey those rules.
No, yeah, there were a lot of runaways. But they were getting kids who were malnourished because, in a lot of cases, the food commodities that were in the treaty were not being delivered. Sometimes they were being delivered and skimmed, and so people were making money on them. But a lot of these kids were not healthy because they were skinny.
Related to that, did you want to tell an environmental story with the bison?
Yeah,
what was your intention with that?
the-
Because we know a little bit more
Yeah.
about that big environmental catastrophe.
Yeah, it's scattered throughout the book. You know, at one point, one of the, I think it might have been General Crook, who was in the so-called Indian Wars, just said, okay, or it might have been actually Sheridan or Sherman, one of the Civil War heroes, just said, well, let's bring in all the buffalo hunters and kill the buffalo, because if they don't have those, they don't eat, and if they don't eat, they're going to be easier to beat. So there was this very, very concerted effort to get rid of this way of life, and since that was the center of many tribes in the plains, that was the first thing that they went to. It's kind of like, if it was Alaska, they would have killed the fish or something like that. Another thing I ran into, to your point, was Mariana Burgess, who was, one of the main. She ran the print shop. Her father had been an Indian agent. She was a Quaker from Philadelphia. Her father had been the Indian agent at the Pawnee Agency, and was fired after he allowed some buffalo were sighted in the area, and the Pawnee said, "Look, we're hungry here. Can we go and hunt them?" And he said, "Okay." And they ran into a Sioux party hunting the same buffalo, and they were enemies, and there was a slaughter. And so she had seen that growing up. She, I think I quoted in the book, she thought these Indians just aren't trying. That if it was white people with these diseases, they would have tried a little harder. So it wasn't just that they were physically, there was something in their spirit, And I think there was a grain of truth in it, is there were a lot of depressed kids there, and when you get hit, your emotional state is part of your health.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. One of the things I was very happy to see that you mentioned early on in the novel, I mean, I generally say to my students, at the University of Minnesota, if there's one thing I want you to know about government boarding school history, that is, it really wasn't about a desire to educate Indians in the U.S. It was about a desire to dispossess Indians of their land. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that connection between the Allotment Act and the boarding school policy.
Yeah, the Dawes Amendment came in the late 1880s, I think, and then in different areas it was kind of, brought to the fore over about a 5-year period. You had heard of it, but they hadn't applied it to your tribe yet. It basically came from lobbyists who wanted that land. And thought, okay, what Indians aren't doing anything with it. We could really do something better with this land and make some money. And so there was a lot of pressure, but there was also this kind of psychological idea about land, which is, well, there are a bunch of socialists. The tribe owns the land. And then they kind of get together and somebody comes to them and says, I think I can handle this many acres and my family's always, camped here by the river and so we should have this spot and whatever. And the Dawes idea was, these people are suffering from socialism and a lack of individualism and the American way. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the land away from the tribe, and then we're going to give it back to the members of the tribe. And I think it was heads of household would get 32 acres, and widows would get 16 acres, and and not necessarily the acres you'd been on before. That there was some shuffling of that. But one of the main features of it was, and you will own that individually, and you'll be able to sell it to anybody you want. And so a lot of reservations, of course, some of it was not very good farmland, and they say, you farm your land. you couldn't make a living that way. And so people got into debt from, buying things at a store or whatever, and they said, well, we'll sell a little bit of our land. And so the reservation land started getting, shrinking and often getting checkerboarded. There's a lot of reservations now that, okay, you go 5 feet in this direction and it's owned by white people, and a few more feet in this one, it still belongs to the tribe. So it was basically a land grab, and the boarding schools kind of fed into that, especially the part about, okay, forget about that old way of life. We want people, if they go back home, to have a totally different mindset about, land. And I think the Ojibwe lost a lot of land during that period.
We
like
did.
Half or more, I think.
Yeah, so with us, allotment tended to come in the very late 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. So that was our big era of dispossession in the Great Lakes. So I was mentioning earlier that for Ojibwe people like me, and one of the main characters in your novel, we are about 200,000 people of the US and Canada. Half of us live up north of the border, and half of us live south of the Canadian border. But it was that timber companies came in and ended up owning a lot of the land on the Ojibwe reservations in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So it was a really terrible era. A lot of land was taken illegally from Native people, and there was a lot of land fraud of that era. I often mention just the story of my grandfather, who was originally from the Mille Lacs Reservation, kind of central Minnesota, and he and his brother and father ended up taking allotments on the White Earth Reservation because they were trying to move all the Ojibwe to one central located reservation within the state. My grandfather he wasn't like my grandfather, or my grandmother. He hadn't gone to boarding school. He spoke Ojibwe. He did not speak English. And after a few years, he met my grandmother and moved to Red Lake, where our family is from today, where my extended family live. But he was living over in a different Ojibwe community, and he was apparently not paying taxes on his land. And he was Ojibwe speaking and so forth. Later on, the courts said that was illegal to tax Indian land. And so my grandfather lost his 160-acre allotment on the White Earth Reservation. And after he passed away, his children, my mother and her siblings, were paid a small amount of money for that dispossession. So there's kind of a rule in the United States, and that is don't give back land to Indians. You can sometimes settle money to them, but it was a very terrible time in the Great Lakes and nationally. And I'm fortunate to be from Red Lake because we're one of the few places in the US that was not an allotted reservation. We had hereditary chiefs. They were very resistant and knew that this was going to be devastating. And so we have a community that's actually, our reservation size in acreage is the same as it was in the late 19th century. But that's the story of very few Indian people. So sometimes people like to say, what can we do about this terrible era of the boarding schools, and how can we ever compensate? And I say, talk to any tribe. That was our big era of dispossession too, and there's a lot we want back. And for us at Red Lake, it's the eastern portion of the upper Red Lake that was just taken off by surveyors and said, oh no, you're not going to have that anymore. And that happened during the allotment era. And so think about the fact that 90 million acres Native people were dispossessed of during the boarding school era. So it wasn't just taking kids to school. That was part of the story. They wouldn't need a homeland anymore, right? That was the sort of thinking at the time. But this big land grab coincided with the boarding school era in the US. And there's a lot we can do about that today. We can't do anything about the suffering of people, but we can certainly do something about the big land grab of that era.
One of the things that was happening that led up partly to the Wounded Knee Massacre. Shortly before 1890, there had been, with the treaty with the Lakota people, the Great Sioux Reservation. And there was one Dakota territory, and they had a big chunk of it. And people started kind of looking at that land and say, well, there's so few of them and it's so much land. What are they doing with it? We should get in there and have farms and stuff like that. And so various lobbyists got busy. And there was a kind of forced vote among the Lakota chiefs, and where they were basically told, well, here's the thing. If you touch the pen, it used to be called, if you couldn't write your name, and agree to be broken up into 5 different reservations with a lot of, not what will be now white people's land in between, we won't just take it away from you. So this is a better deal if you do this. A few chiefs, who are among the people who were still very unhappy, resisted that, but basically most people did. And one of the kind of pressure tactics they used, Captain Pratt, when he went to the Army and said, I'd like to start this school, can I use this barracks? You're not using it. Was destroyed by Jeb Stuart, on his way to Gettysburg in the Civil War. I'll fix it up and everything. And they said, well, okay, a couple things. One is it has to, have industrial in the title, because there's a lot of people, the idea of teaching academics to Indian kids is just crazy to them. We don't want to be embarrassed. And the other one is you have to get the sons and daughters of a bunch of Lakota chiefs to go there, basically hostages. And that's a kind of deal he was willing to make. And he thought, well, it would be good for them. But it was also one of these things of they're really unhappy about all this land that was taken away from them. Well, this will keep them back on their much smaller reservations. Now we have their sons and daughters.
We have time for questions from the audience. Do we want to bring the microphone? We're coming
Microphones
down
are coming
to you.
to your neighborhood.
Yeah.
Yes, if you wouldn't mind waiting until the microphone arrives so that you can be picked up by the recording.
Somebody
It's right
had their
up
hand
here.
up. Yeah.
Raise your hand again, please. Yep. Yeah.
And my question to Sayles is, are you ever considering maybe Save the Man to a movie someday?
Very good, yeah. So if your microphone is apparently not on, but I did hear the question, and it was, what do I think of the Land O'Lakes taking the princess off, and then for you, are you going to make this into a film? Okay, so I will go first, and it's kind of funny because the Land O'Lakes is an old Minnesota dairy company, started out as a cooperative in the early part of the 20th century. And usually Native people dislike the stereotypes and, that princess was on the butter box for so many years. And where I'm from up at Red Lake, there's a very distinguished fine artist, Patrick Desjardins. And like a lot of artists, my husband is an artist as well, you kind of have to do something to make a living. And Patrick Desjardins became a commercial artist for Land O'Lakes. And he was responsible for updating the Land O'Lakes princess. And he also made the Hams Bear. Did you have Hams Bear? That commercial in the 50s. And so Red Lakers, where I'm from, are extremely fond of the Land O'Lakes princess. We make an exception. It's the Land O'Lakes princess exception in kind of stereotypes of Native women. Because he updated her outfit, he changed the landscape to look very much like our landscapes of northern Minnesota. So it's kind of a quirky answer that I have for you related to the Land O'Lakes princess. But what was the joke, Steve, that people said they... They took the Indian off but kept the land. Oh, yeah, so you
Yeah.
have a landscape now.
Yeah.
You don't have the Indian anymore. So everyone was joking about it.
Yeah, but I do believe it was time for the Redskins to change their name.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, way past time. I had written a script of this story 20 years ago when we tried to raise money. We were never, it's a pretty big story, so we were never able to raise the money to make it. And after 20 years of kind of trying and doing other things, I just felt like it was such a good story that I should make it into a book. And when you do that, you can do more scale. You don't have to pay for everything that happens. And so and this has happened. Jamie McGillivray was a screenplay first. And once you do that, you've kind of done it. You've kind of shot your emotions and your energy into it. However, I would say there's 50 great stories that could be told just from Carlisle. Some of them have Jim Thorpe in them, and some of them don't. And then the other boarding school, stories, all of them, some with their own kind of feel to them. Some of them just horrendous, and some of them mixed bags or whatever as far as the experience of the kids. So it's certainly something that I hope somebody starts making movies about.
We have time for a few more questions. Other questions?
Yes, thank you for being here. I'm an enrolled member of the Stockbridge Muncie Mohican, and I wanted to ask about how discipline was handled at the progressive Captain Pratt's school. Mm-hmm. My wife and I were riding with my father through the reservation some years ago, and he pulled over to talk to an older man on the side of the road. And afterwards, my wife said, "Gordon, that man was missing fingers. Was that an agricultural accident?" Mm-hmm. And my father said, "No, he was in an Indian school, and when he spoke the native language, mm-hmm. they would cut off a joint of a finger." Ooh. Now, I've heard people talk about cutting hair, and that mm-hmm. has its own cultural crime to it, but cutting off fingers seems to me a little extreme. I wonder how it was at Carlisle.
Yeah, Carlisle, it evolved. Because he'd spent time with Native people, Pratt understood a little bit about the cultures, and that embarrassment and shame were probably the strongest thing you could do. So he tried to develop a Carlisle culture. Military school, there are officers, the upper officers who are other Native kids in uniform, the master sergeants and the lieutenants, they ran the court-martials on Saturday. And one of the main violations was speaking your own language. You were put in, 4 boys to a room, 3 girls to a room, never with somebody who spoke your language. And if you got caught talking it, it was usually a couple days in the brig, which was built by the Hessians in the Revolutionary period. So it was a little stone cabin, and you got fed, but not the best of food. You got kind of bread and water for a couple days. Running away, you got more time. Early on, very early on, there was some beating with a rod. And very quickly they realized some of these kids are pretty big and they could take that rod away. So then they went to a belt. And even that was getting to be, with the bigger kids, a little scary for the disciplinarians who were afraid of getting. So it was mostly shame. And sometimes in the school newspaper, somebody would be called out and made to feel ashamed of themselves. And then this kind of sometimes solitary confinement because nobody's in there, but sometimes there was a bunch of you in there. Sometimes it was loss of privileges, like in other prisons. I would say that some of the kids were, "Oh, this is easy compared to where I came from," and others were just like, "How come these people are allowed to do this to me?"
One of the things that you see often, I always notice looking at kind of documents and early observations of indigenous people by Europeans, one of the comments that they made again and again and again is, Indian people love their children. And I thought, what does that mean? Didn't the Europeans love their children? This is an interesting observation, but it was all about the style of child rearing, that corporal punishment was very much a European way, and it was part of the boarding school history, but it was part of U.S. schools as well, right? Corporal punishment. And after a while, that becomes illegal and outlawed in the U.S. Well into the 20th century. But for the most part, it was a very different style of interacting with children in the boarding school era. And one of the most fun things that I kind of discovered when I started doing research, which was boarding schools was the topic of my first book years ago, but I was doing this research when I was a young person in my 20s, and discovering the incredible resistance of students in the government boarding schools. They ran away, they went home to see their families, they rode trains. There are many stories of boarding school arson. And I always like to recommend one of my favorite books. This one's from Ontario, but it's Basil Johnston's book, Indian School Days. He's a very funny man, but he talks about the ways that kids in the government boarding schools tried the patience of the adults who ran their lives. And so that's the other important thing to remember. And my big takeaway from doing research on boarding schools in the Midwest in the early 20th century was never underestimate American Indian families. Despite the difficulties of this era, people stayed in touch. People behaved like parents. They communicated with their children. Kids went home to see their families, even though it was against the rules, right? And so it was kind of like a constant negotiation that was taking place between the boarding schools and the people who ran them and the parents at home, who were always trying to get their kids to come back for visits and to see them on a more regular basis. The other important thing to remember about this era is that boarding schools pretty much ended in the United States in the 1930s under FDR. So we look at it as this 50-year period, this half century of very misguided Indian education policy, but misguided Indian policy overall, right? Because it's Carlisle up until FDR, and that's the big land grab also of that 90 million acres of land.
We have time for one or two more questions, right over here.
Thank you for being here. I'll try to be brief, but you probably know I talk too much. Is there anything that I can personally or generally do to help or hurt the situation? For instance, just being aware of the situation is helpful. I don't know if there's anything that I can do like to help, because unfortunately, persecution of minorities, Native people, a whole bunch of other people still go on and can be a lot worse. So there could be something I can do, just like just be aware of the situation. I don't know what else we can do, but if something you can recommend or recommend I avoid doing, please let me know.
That's really a great question. And I guess I would say just, maybe a nice thing to do would be to make a donation to tribal colleges, or to support the work of especially young people right now. Our tribal college movement is being currently examined in the United States, and the funding for tribal colleges, which has been an incredibly successful movement. We also have a lot of language immersion schools trying to undo the work of the boarding school era. Where I teach at the University of Minnesota, I always think this is, justice. You can major in Ojibwe or Dakota language at the University of Minnesota. And so those immersion schools need help as well, or just kind of support that work or read about it and be informed.
Yeah, I think also, depending on where you live, you can just do a little bit of research and see what's going on with land rights. And with tribes who are trying to get recognized as tribes, who have for hundreds of years maybe been trying to get, and put some support behind them. Write to your congressman if there's something going on in your area or your state.
All right, I think we can squeeze in one more question right here.
Thank you. My question is actually about another work of yours, if that's okay. One of my favorite all-time movies, The Secret of Rowan Inish, because I teach Irish. And I just wanted to comment first, very briefly, that what you're saying about the speaking of the language and being punished was also true with Irish, Welsh, and Scottish Gaelic. They weren't residential schools, so you didn't have that kind of brig or anything, but they were beaten even if they didn't know any English yet, if they spoke in their native language. But my question about the movie was just, was there any particular reason that you, latched onto this story and decided to make this movie, or any anecdotes about it?
Yeah. My wife read the book that it came from when she was 10 years old. And it was called The Secret of Ron Morscary, and it was set in Scotland. And I'm part Irish, and I knew Irish culture a lot better than I did Scottish, and they have the same seals, so I figured it would work there. And she just kept bugging me, and finally I read this very slim, very beautifully illustrated by the author children's book. And adding very little to it, I said, this would make a really good movie. And I had a fondness for the kind of pre-Haley Mills, pre-Disney Haley Mills movies when I was a kid. So I had to hang out with that girl. And I just felt, well, I don't really know of that many kids' movies where the girl's just the hero. And she actually does things. It's just not magic. So it just seemed like, oh, there's a gap here that we could help fill. And it was really fun to make. Thank you.
All right. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we will have to leave it there. There are books for sale by both of these speakers up in the lobby, and there will be a book signing. But before we adjourn, could we please thank these two speakers for an incredible conversation?